So, step 2, explore alternative fuels and technology types. So really now I'm going to talk to you about heavy duty vehicles. So in the previous unit we discussed the air quality and health impacts and impacts on climate change. So now we're going to discuss the second of the 2 approaches needed to help tackle these issues and others, including things like congestion and cost and stuff like that. So now this one is really going to focus on heavy duty vehicles. So that's going to include buses as well. So there's a few different types available. I'll show them to you now very briefly. So gas buses and trucks, both generally available. Perhaps not so much in the truck segments, but yeah, generally available. But heavy trucks, not so much. Biofuel, again, if they're available. Again, buses, not all trucks, not quite there yet, but sort of there. Buses, again, hybrids, very much available. And trucks, again, not so much, but available for some very specific types of truck, but certainly not all types of truck. Plug-in hybrids, there are some trials happening with buses and plug-in hybrids, and that they'll probably continue for a little while longer. Some OEMs, some manufacturers are certainly running trials in some cities, sometimes with EU funding, and it's the kind of thing that you might be able to be involved in. For example, if you are a local authority and you can offer a bus route and some kind of incentive. Again, with trucks, plug-in hybrids really not properly available. There's a few sort of demonstration type trials available, but not really. Electric buses available. You have to really consider the route they're going on, though. But then they're available, but they're not. They're not as commonplace and easy as a diesel bus. Same with trucks. Again, there's some electric trucks available, but they're not quite what you expect from a diesel or petrol. They have issues. Obviously, a battery weighs a lot, so the load issues then come in. So where you just can't carry as much goods as you'd like to be able to carry. Again, hydrogen, that's quite a long way off. Trials in both segments, particularly buses, but they're much further away than all of the other ones. So alternative fuel vehicles do exist, but they're not really that available. So the issue is that there's buses that tell you what they're going to run on, and the diesel buses and trucks, and there's a cycle, a test cycle that they're tested against, and that produces Euro standard. That means they meet the Euro standard. However, this Euro standard is based just on the engine rather than the whole type approved vehicle, which means that if that engine is put into a different application, for example, if it's designed to be run on a truck and it's put in a bus, then the emissions are going to be very different to what is advertised. So there is a new drive cycle that's being developed called SORT, S-O-R-T, and you should sort of use in your assessments is the SORT drive cycle rather than the standard one, if at all possible. So yeah, it has the urban, semi-urban and rural based buses running rather than what you might expect with a normal Euro standard, which is really based on a truck sitting there, an engine designed for a truck sitting there doing a truck duty cycle on a motorway or on a straight piece of road going at 55 miles per hour, however many kilometres that is. Whereas the SORT cycle looks at stop-start behaviour associated with a bus. So general rules for hybrid heavy-duty vehicles, if you're going to consider them. The operator, whoever's driving the vehicle, isn't really going to notice a difference. They're really suited to stop-start, as you might expect. Huge savings can actually be had, up to 30% with the latest, more than that with the latest hybrid buses, but only really when they're used in real stop-starts. As you can imagine, there's a battery that can be charged as the bus is braking, and then used as the bus moves off again. So the stop-start conditions associated with urban driving really do suit hybrids, and there are quite significant savings. There's not really any adaptation required. You don't have to do anything different. You just buy the vehicles, run them as usual. You might need some extra things in your maintenance side. So the garage technicians might require a bit more training, or they might be specialist people who come in from the bus manufacturer that do all of the hybrid side, the electrics side of the vehicle. So yeah, lots of fleets around Europe, such as London and Barcelona, have got hybrid buses, and a lot of them. They're becoming more prevalent, and the costs, although they do cost more, and they probably would require some kind of subsidy to actually make them financially viable, because even though there are savings over their lifetime, the savings don't generally match the extra costs associated with purchasing the vehicle. So subsidies are probably going to be required for a good few years with hybrid buses. They're still, relatively, they're not too much more expensive than a conventional bus, and you might be able to justify the extra cost because of the air quality associated, emission savings and the CO2 savings as well. Much less common in trucks. There are some trials with refuse trucks, for example, obviously another stop-start situation with a refuse truck, so hybrid makes a lot of sense, but not something really for the here and now to consider, whereas hybrid buses really are. They're something that you can procure most of the time right now for most situations. The general rules for gas and biofuel vehicles. Again, they're similar to conventional ICE, but instead of using diesel, they use an alternative combustion material. So they can come from various different renewable sources, so crops and waste and lots of the amount of different ways that you can get biofuels will blow your mind, to be honest with you. There are lots of different ways, and considering where it comes from is going to be something that's very important when you are considering particularly CO2 savings. So I know that in Scandinavia, for example, they've got a very well set up system, which means that they get biofuels that have very little CO2 associated with the production, and so they'll be able to claim huge CO2 benefits from running these types of vehicles. So gas vehicles, straight gas vehicles, will either be liquefied as LNG or compressed as compressed natural gas. Generally, an LNG vehicle, a gas tank for an LNG vehicle will be, this kind of size, and be able to have the same amount of gas as a number of large gas tanks. For compressed natural gas, it's far more space efficient. So liquefied natural gas you'll often find in tractor units, so the front bit of an articulated vehicle, for example, because they don't have very much space to fit gas tanks on. Whereas a CNG vehicle, so compressed natural gas, there's obviously lots of room on top of a single-decker bus, for example, where the CNG tanks can fit. Obviously this gas can come from renewable sources such as biogas. Now there are many heavy vehicles and different types of variations of these available, mostly in the sort of trial stages. There are commercially available vehicles certainly out there. They're less kind of well developed as diesel and petrol vehicles, diesel vehicles obviously, but they are certainly developed enough for you to seriously consider them as an alternative fuel. You obviously need to think of the refuelling infrastructure, but most of the time for bus operations and some truck operations, that's not really an issue because all the refuelling will happen within the depot. So yeah, you think about different sources and consider the CO2 associated with the different sources. And yeah, sometimes they can be close to zero or lower than zero, depending on how they're produced. So now electric. So it may not be as simple as just building, considering what type of fuel you're going to use for the vehicle and then running the vehicle as standard. You might actually have to really think about running the route around what infrastructure you can give for that route. So, for example, there's lots of examples of buses running operationally. For example, Nottingham in the UK has got a fleet of almost 50 buses fairly soon it will be more than 50 buses, and they're running commercially viable bus routes. They're getting the electricity from municipal waste centre. It's a really good example of electric buses being used sort of commercially in the UK. There are subsidies in place to make that work, but yeah, they certainly are operationally used. And in China there's huge amounts of examples of electric buses being used for urban routes. What you really need to think about though is where the vehicle is going to be charged. Now if you've got a fairly simple light route that maybe has a lot of space in that route for charging to happen, that's one thing. But if you're running a very, very difficult urban city centre route where the buses are often delayed because of traffic and things like that, you don't want a stranded bus in the middle of nowhere. So you need to really have maybe charging at either end, some kind of novel charging mechanism, or a very big battery that allows the bus to run for most of the route or most of its day on that battery. Things you need to then think about though is that if the battery is taking up so much of the weight, you might not be able to fit as many passengers, or be allowed to have as many passengers on board with the weight of the battery associated. What maybe another example is if a bus route has perhaps generally diesel vehicles or hybrid vehicles on it, you then maybe just insert 1 or 2 electric buses into that route for say the peak hours, for example, where there's less demand. So if the bus runs out of electricity after maybe doing 3 or 4 routes, it's not so important because the peak's over and it can then charge during the off-peak period and then go back out for the peak again in the afternoon, evening. So yeah, there are some examples of electric trucks, but they're generally not so commercially used, but worth thinking about. The other thing we're thinking about charging is, are you going to be able to charge your bus? Now there's generally 3 regimes for charging. One regime is where you just charge your bus entirely up at the beginning of the day, it runs its route, gets home, charged up overnight, runs its route the next day. The other one is you have a far smaller battery or energy storage system on board, and then at either end it gets very, very fast charged. Smaller battery, probably a bit cheaper, more expensive on the infrastructure side, cheaper on the bus side, more passengers can fit on the bus with the weight restrictions. And then the third one is a mixture of the two, where it does charge overnight, and then during the day, as the battery is depleted, it's then topped up a bit at the end, either end of the route, and there's maybe a bit more flexibility with that system. CO2 is generally reduced with that type of regime, or any type of electric bus that's used, and the PM and NOx will be 0 from the bus, and that's where the sensitive receptors generally are, where the bus is running, so it's certainly an improvement there. They can be more expensive to purchase, that's something certainly to consider, but then the reduced running costs, often because you're not buying diesel, can outweigh the extra cost of purchasing the bus there. But again, that's something really to consider and demonstrate sometimes before you're able to purchase the vehicles. So general rules for plug-in hybrid, they don't really exist at present, there's only trials, but what they're going to have is a diesel engine and an electric motor in the same way as a plug-in hybrid car has. Sometimes that engine will then run the wheels themselves, or sometimes the engine will charge up the battery, and the battery will always be running the vehicle. Now, the issues with that is they are more expensive. You've got a lot more technology on board, but the benefit is that you are able to run those vehicles almost exclusively, potentially in zero emission mode, and only have the engine as a backup, potentially during peak times when the bus isn't able to stop at either end because of the traffic, or potentially towards the end of the day if the battery is more depleted. Now, another thing that is being looked at is having the electric only bit of the route to be geofenced. So for example, your city centre, you may have the electric only mode during the city centre running of the bus. So this means that the bus obviously doesn't produce harmful emissions where the main issue is, the quality issue is. It's certainly something that's being considered around the UK, and yeah, something to think about if you're going to go for these buses. But again, as I say, they really are in their infancy at the moment, but there are manufacturers producing these buses and they will need to trial them and demonstrate them somewhere, so something to consider. Now, hydrogen, it's not really something you're going to be associated with in the short term, but over the next, especially if you're thinking of hydrogen buses, over the next few years, there's going to be big European calls for running hydrogen buses in your city. So there's a thing called the Joint Hydrogen Fuels Undertaking. If you Google that, you can find out more information about it, and potentially, if you're interested, you can get involved in some of those large-scale demonstrations. Yeah, and you're looking at more around the 2020 timescale for them to potentially be more effective. So, if you would like to tell me about the bus route in your town, if you are running this training yourself, obviously at this point you would ask people in the room about the bus route in their town. Ask the questions, what is the current duty cycle? Do you have any low emission buses going at the moment in your city? And what type of budget do you have potentially to trial these types of vehicles, these types of novel vehicles?